So far, we've gone over the structure of an HTML document, how it has a doc type HTML on top, it has a head, a body, a title that goes inside the head that's indicated in the top of the web page. Plus, we've also introduced some important text tags, specifically a heading tag, an H2 tag for a subtitle, and keep in mind there are also H3, H4, all the way to H6. And we've also introduced a paragraph tag, and in the last lecture we went into self-closing tags such as the break tag, and also special reserved characters inside of HTML, like the ampersand, the less than sign, and the greater than sign. I'm just going to delete this little sentence here so that our letter to the web browser flows a little bit better. And then finally, I'm just going to add sincerely another paragraph tag, Yatit. There we go. Now we've finished our letter to the web browser. Now let's save this file and move on. I pressed Command N there to create a new file. Remember, memorize the shortcuts. Command N or Control N to start a new file. And then I'm gonna call this file text formatting. So now we're gonna get into some text formatting elements. I did mention last time that HTML is not really meant for styling your web page, but it does have some formatting elements, and these formatting elements are important to know. So just like before, we'll create our HTML file with a head and a body. Inside the head, we'll give it a title, Introduction to Text Formatting in HTML. And then in our body, actually let's make the title shorter, like Text Formatting in HTML. And in the body, we'll create an H1 tag that's a little bit more descriptive. We'll call it Introduction to Text Formatting in HTML. Now, we're going to do something a little bit meta here, and what I mean by that is that we're going to create a reference sheet for ourselves to remind ourselves of how to work with HTML using HTML. You'll see what I mean in just a second. Because really, there are a select few tags in HTML that will come up over and over and over again. And you will probably want a handy way to reference these tags. Underneath our introduction to text formatting in HTML, let's create a subtitle. And we'll call this subtitle pre-styled tags. Underneath our subtitle, we're going to add an H1 tag and call it H1. Underneath it, we'll add an H2 tag, H2. Then underneath that, we'll add an H3. And underneath that, an H4. And notice how the size of the font keeps getting just a little bit smaller along the way. An H5. All the way up to an H6. Now if we do an H7, we'll notice that the font size has reverted back to a normal text font. Next, we'll create a paragraph tag. You should already be familiar with this, and we'll call it "This is a standard paragraph tag," which is the most common tag in HTML. Now don't quote me on that. Depending on who designed a web page, they may choose to use a different tag, like a span, instead of a paragraph. Which brings me to the next tag. Actually, before we go into the next tag, which will be a span tag, I spoiled it for you ahead of time, let's practice our special characters. This is a standard paragraph tag, And then we're going to say end, the ampersand, less than, semicolon, P, and then another ampersand, greater than, semicolon. So that created a paragraph looking tag inside of our HTML document. So this is a standard paragraph tag, which is the most common tag in HTML. Now let's go on to the next tag, the span tag. The span tag is actually very similar to the paragraph tag. So I'm going to write a short message here. The span tag is very similar to the paragraph tag. And I'm actually going to put the word span inside less than and greater than sign. It does have a key difference though, is that we can put a span tag after another span tag and it won't create a new line. The key difference between a span tag and a paragraph tag is that a span tag doesn't create a new line. This is a very subtle difference, and it actually, behind the scenes, goes into how HTML elements are actually styled by default. The paragraph tag by default is a block style element. Notice that for block style elements, brackets actually recognizes them as taking up the entire width of the page. But when I mouse over the span tag, brackets recognizes that span tags can be any width. So the span tag takes up as much horizontal space as the text inside of it. So in this case, if I were to highlight the text bracket style, I would actually highlight this space right here to represent the first span tag. I would highlight this space to represent the second span tag in our paragraph. So key difference here between the paragraph tag and the span tag: the span tag only takes up as much width as the text or the elements inside of the span tag. The paragraph tag and the heading tags take up the full width of the page. So even if I were to put this span tag on a new line, notice that it doesn't change how it's displayed inside the HTML. Now we are ready for the next step. One of the greatest features of HTML, and in fact it's such a great feature that it's built into its very name, is the ability to create links to other pages. The HT in HTML stands for hypertext, and hypertext is the key distinguishing feature of HTML. And really what hypertext stands for is just a link. And in order to create a link to another page, we start by creating the A tag, and let's say this is a link. And notice that the A tag is also very similar to a span tag. It did not start a new line. So an A tag is not a block style element, but an inline element. We're going to give an attribute called href equals http google.com. You can probably imagine what this is going to do when I click on this link. It'll take me to google.com. That's fine. Let's go back to our live preview. So what I added here is what's called an attribute to a tag. href is a reference attribute where we can specify a web page or another HTML file. Various tags have many different attributes, and these attributes allow us to customize the tag in a specific way. Notice that the attributes must be declared inside the opening tag, and after the attribute we have an equal sign and double quotes specifying the value of the attribute. So inside the opening tag we have the attribute name, an equal sign, and a double quotes specifying the value of the attribute. Now let's add that into our cheat sheet. This is a link to google.com with an attribute href equal to http google.com. Now just for clarity purposes, let's create a break here. And also, this is a link created by the less than a greater than tag to google.com with an attribute href equals http google.com. And this attribute is declared inside the opening tag. So clicking on this sentence right here is going to take us to google.com. Now here's where things get a little bit interesting. You may also see an attribute referred to as a property. And these two things are often interchangeable, but they're not exactly the same thing. An attribute is specific to a tag. However, a property is specific to an element. And I've made the distinction between a tag and an element before, so you'll see this distinction come up very frequently. So let's tackle this head on, the distinction between a tag and an element, and also the distinction between an attribute and an actual property. So I've mentioned before how a tag is this opening tag or this closing tag, but an element is what's created inside the browser by a combination of the open tag and the closing tag. This distinction between the actual written HTML code and how it's rendered in the browser will come up a lot in your journey as a web designer or web developer. And a word that you'll see come up inevitably is the DOM, or the Document Object Model. For now, all you need to know about the DOM is that it is the browser's interpretation of HTML. For all intents and purposes, for this part of the course, the DOM is going to be the same as the HTML file that we're going to be creating. However, as you become a more advanced web developer or designer, the code that you write will manipulate the DOM in the browser in really interesting ways. And it won't just be the HTML file manipulating the DOM, it'll actually be other files. It may even be a JavaScript file that interacts with the DOM inside the browser in really interesting and meaningful ways. So again, just a little bit of a conceptual overview. An element is what the browser creates from tags, and inside the browser, an element has a property. Whereas inside the HTML file, the tag has an attribute.